Hello watch enthusiasts, and welcome to a very new feature here on Watch Chronicler, and this is a podcast to go alongside the website and the YouTube videos. Now, for a while I've sort of mulled over the idea of a podcast because they're growing in popularity, and also because the concept is quite appealing in terms of giving a certain amount of content which doesn't require the commitment of sitting down and reading an article or watching a video. So I'm going to be starting these, and for the next few weeks I'll produce about one a week and see how it goes. Because there have been a variety of podcasts, and quite a few really enjoyable ones, like Scottish Watches, for example, which I listen to, and of course you have Hodinky Radio, which I think is pretty much the gold standard in terms of bringing in people to talk. But this is going to be something a little bit different, in the sense that I was going to produce something alone, if you will, without collaboration with anyone else to start off with, because I'd like to produce a sort of informal version of my videos, which give answers to questions existing in the industry, and also questions which have come up, but I am also open to the idea of answering questions from you, listeners, viewers and readers, because I think this is something important about a community within the watch world. As you will have noticed perhaps already, this isn't scripted at all, and is produced in a much more relaxed way than my normal videos, which are edited quite carefully, and the script is written in advance to give only a certain line of discussion, because that's what I'd like to say, but this will be much more loose and much more free. And so today's theme really is Seiko, and I've spoken about Seiko before, because I think they're going through a time of change and upheaval as they adopt something of a more Swiss approach to watches, and for better or for worse it's changing the brand. And I'd like to compare them to Citizen, because Citizen is a brand which has long lived in the shadow of Seiko, and despite the fact that they produce an enormous number of watches per year, and indeed are extremely well accepted, I think they've never really been taken into the watch world in the same way as Seiko has with Grand Seiko. But first we should probably begin with Seiko, as a brand which is enormously well known, universally admired I think within the industry, but which has taken a few strange sort of turns over the past year or so towards a very different aim. Now, traditionally Seiko was known for producing very high quality watches, which gave a lot of Western watches a real run for their money. And I think this fitted them rather well. They were also somewhat irreverent in terms of not producing what was necessarily trendy at any given time, but producing something which was much more universally appreciated because of its originality. If you look at the Seiko SKX007, it's a perfect example of this kind of approach. But of course, in terms of recent news, we've all heard that Seiko has pulled out of Baselworld for 2020 to follow this great slew of brands which have given up their position at this show. And I won't really talk about this directly because I think that's a separate matter, but it is demonstrative of the sort of changes seen at Seiko. And I wouldn't normally go into a subject twice because I've spoken about this on the channel before, and indeed that video has done surprisingly well actually. But it's a situation where we have Seiko producing watches which just keep on missing the mark. I mean, take the 50th anniversary remake of their famous 1969 Quartz Astron. Now, the original did cost 450,000 yen, so it was a watch which cost the same price as has been publicised, a Toyota. And the new version does, in truth, fit within that sort of price range. It costs $36,000, which is a not insignificant amount of money, let's face it, for a quartz watch. And whilst I think it would make sense to have a watch at this level to celebrate such an anniversary, I think a watch which has a CE logo on the caseback, which means Conformité Européenne, which means that it conforms within EU regulations, is not something you want to see on a watch of this luxurious price, nor, frankly, do you want to see laser etching on the caseback. So, despite the fact that it has a perpetual calendar, which runs with GPS, I think the cherry on the top was the fact that it's actually less accurate than the watch which spawned it 50 years ago, which I think is a letdown, quite frankly. The other way to come at these problems within Seiko is the fact that, with regards to branding and the way they arrange their range in total, and their sub-brands like Prospex, for example, there's a great deal of trouble in terms of differentiating what each product actually offers. Now, if I take the Prospex line as an example, these are technical watches, usually dive watches just because of the nature of the watches which are most popular from Seiko. We have watches from about £300 to well over £5,000 lumped into a single category, which I think makes them difficult to understand even for someone who's particularly into watches, let alone the average consumer who really just wants to buy a watch. And if you look at the top of that range, at this new LX line, which were nominated, as far as I understand, for awards just very recently, these are watches which are, I'm sure, wonderfully made, and brilliant watches, whether you go for the GMT version or the dive watch or the field style GMT. I think that you have a difficult watch to sell because it has a spring drive movement, so Seiko's proprietary, very impressive quartz regulation for a mechanical movement, which makes them very accurate. There's no argument there. But the problem here is that you have a watch which is not a Grand Seiko, which costs not only more than quite a lot of Grand Seikos within the family, but also is only two or £300 less than the Grand Seiko equivalent of this watch, which has the same movement but better finished, significantly better finished, superior branding and general better fit and finish because of the nature of being a much higher end watch. Because the LX, the top of the range LX, which is the dive watch, costs £5,400, and £5,600 you can get that Grand Seiko. So we're in a very difficult position, not to mention the extension of the Presage line as a sort of a pseudo dress range with some sporting characteristics, with this prestige line within the Presage line, which is a spring drive dress watch with a beautifully made hand produced fired dial in black or white, which I'm sure is wonderful. But then they spoil the watch by offering it for $4,500 with a laser engraved case back, which really doesn't befit the price whatsoever, and a case and crown which looks like it comes off their £400 or £500 models within the same range of Presage watches. So to say this range is confused is frankly an understatement. And to add a cherry on the top of this chronically misguided range, we have the new Seiko 5. And this is a watch which actually, I think, could have been a real success, and I'm sure will be an economic success because it approaches a new market. But I can't help feel weakens the brand, because this is a watch which is designed to follow the Seiko 5, which is not a dive watch. It's just an appealing, multi-purpose mechanical sports watch, which has been made for many years by Seiko, and is a really well-loved section of their range. But I think the difficult position which we're in with this new watch is that while Seiko's discontinued their fabled SKX watch as their base entry-level dive watch, which is a superb watch in terms of just being an elegant piece of design, with this new model you have the same case taken from that, but with no screw-down crown, much lower water resistance, and also a design which isn't designed to be legible. So they've taken a dive watch, downgraded it, and given it an unloomed bezel. It's like Rolex taking a Submariner case and branding it as a date just with no water resistance, or minimal water resistance. It just doesn't make sense. So I think we're in a difficult position, but this is where I'd like to move on to Citizen, because Citizen is a brand which is often ignored by a lot of people, and I must say I'm also partly responsible for this because I haven't given them the same time on my channel as Seiko in previous years, but I will be keeping an eye on them in future, because they've produced a few watches recently which, I've got to admit, are difficult to argue with in terms of quality, value, and also in terms of what they offer to the industry where movements are concerned. When we look at Citizen today, it can be difficult to sort of see through the sheer number of models they offer, because in much the same way as Seiko has, they've courted the much more accessible market, and also shops within more rural areas, not just in boutiques in the cities, which is, I think, a very wise choice, but it fits with their business model. But historically they've produced a wide array of watches, and now are very much invested within quartz and their eco-drive solar-powered watches, which I think are an impressive addition to the watch industry, because they do offer something of a no-brainer if you want something which doesn't have the clear life of a quartz movement, but also which doesn't have the risks of problems which are inherent within mechanical movements, which are less reliable in general than quartz movements. So with these eco-drive watches, they've released an array, whether you look at the ProMaster range, for example, which offers a lot of sports watches, and designs have historically been relatively unremarkable. There aren't that many people, for instance, who collect Citizen, whereas there are a great deal who collect Seiko, and it's difficult to put one's finger on what actually is the difference here. But certainly Seiko's done a better job in the past, but I think now we're really seeing changes from Citizen, and chief amongst these, I think, is their creation of high-end watches, which has changed the public view of Citizen. And I think the first watch for me which really demonstrated this was the eco-drive 1, and this piece was released in 2017. And it's a watch which offers a new level of finesse, and I mean that quite literally, because these are immensely slender watches. And they use this solar technology where they use the dial as a photovoltaic cell to give the watch, in the case of these pieces, a 100-day power reserve, which is a bit less than its larger siblings, but nonetheless perfectly fine because, just wearing this watch in the sun will recharge it. And these had a 1mm thick solar movement, which is frankly remarkable and would be completely impossible at a vaguely achievable price range with a mechanical movement. And so the full thickness of these watches is 2.98mm thick, but they're still usable because they have a screwed bezel, which on most models is made out of cermet, which is essentially heat-sintered metal and ceramic, to keep the watch rigid, which was a problem with some ultra-thin watches in the 80s and late 70s, for instance, which would bend, which obviously is not something which is in any way possible to market as a publicly available watch. And these pieces were not cheap and still are available, and cost in the low thousands, which is not an easy market to approach for a quartz movement, but I think with what they're offering there, it's a very interesting option. But the watch which really has demonstrated that they have technical prowess is this new caliber 0100. And this is a movement which is accurate as indeed no other brand's been able to offer to 1 second per year. And these offer a dress watch at the moment with a crystal-inspired case, and they use some very impressive technologies within the movement, such as an anti-backlash system for the seconds so as to hit every marker perfectly, and also you can jump the hour hand back and forth in order to avoid some difficulties where if you cross a time zone you have to halt the watch, which of course spoils the point of having a watch which is so incredibly accurate. But what I think is most important with this watch is that it isn't simply a technological concept within a case which hasn't been thought through. Instead, we have a design which stands alone beautifully, with really exquisite finishing to the hands, the dial, and the whole concept doesn't have any of these sort of moments where we've looked at Seikos in the past and said they've just missed the mark, with, for example, too much text on the dial, or easily scratched crystals, or things of this nature. It just works. We'd simply have Citizen on the dial, no other text, a beautiful tone, and a unique form for this case, which means these are really unique watches in the industry, both technologically and aesthetically, which justifies the multi-thousand-pound price for these watches, because they can very, very squarely step back and say, this is the best quartz movement in the world. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But if you're a brand as large as Citizen, you can't offer these halo watches without offering an accessible level of watch. And I don't mean a highly affordable level, but I just mean an accessible level. And I think they've done so very well. If I take, for example, the ProMaster 1000 meter diver, now this is a huge 52+ mm watch, and it's not for everyone. In fact, it's for a very small demographic. But I still respect Citizen for producing it, because it's beautifully made with a lot of very clever technology, with a titanium case, a very impressive technology where it comes to the bezel action, so as to not be able to move it in any case where you wouldn't want to. And of course it has the same style of movement with a power reserve indicator and this solar recharging. So it's a general build which is impressive in titanium to offer this 1000-meter dive watch, which really is a true tool. You couldn't look at it and say, oh, it's been made for vanity or anything like that. It really is a tool. And I feel this clarity of purpose, where the most technologically advanced watch in the range is the top-end model, is something which has become detached from Seiko. If I return to that LX range, which I do like, I must say, it sounds like I'm giving it an awfully hard time, but as a standalone watch I think it looks fantastic, but just within the range it's difficult to comprehend, because if we look at the diving version, it's designed to be the top-of-the-range model from Seiko. But at the same time, whereas the former Marine Master, so their 300-meter dive watch, which is just under £3,000 in the SLA range, so the SLA 21 and 23, these are watches which have ceramic bezels, sapphire crystals, and are very modern in that approach, but they're not designed to be as high-end as the LX, yet that doesn't get the ceramic bezel, instead it has a lacquered bezel. So they've given the more technologically advanced watch designed to do a function more effectively technology which isn't as resilient. It just doesn't make sense. Now the final component to this all is movements. Now, where Seiko has largely axed their 7S26 watches, which were rudimentary and didn't have hacking or hand winding, Citizen does still produce its 8000 series movements. Now these are movements which are old-fashioned, they don't hack or hand wind, and they're pretty crude. in terms of their functionality, but they do offer a lot of complications, which can be run off different parts of the movement, like 24 hours, for instance, or small seconds run directly off the back of the escapement. So I believe that they still fit within the ranges of a lot of customers of Citizen, and indeed they still fit within their range to an extent. But they are offering movements which now are much more impressive, but also fit much better into the general world of what people regard as good movements. Now, Seiko undoubtedly produce great movements. They're not necessarily the same style as Swiss movements. They tend to have a lower beat rate, unless you go up to the Grand Seiko or just below Grand Seiko 8L range of movements. But what we see with Citizens is that they're able to offer models such as the 9015 or other 9000 series movements. And these are movements which run at 4 Hz, like ETA 2824s, are automatic and are very refined. They have a very low fail rate, that's below 1%. Of these movements can't fit within parameters or indeed work without fault, where ETA struggle to get below 2%. So it is a difficult position here for those Swiss movements, which are much more old-fashioned in design to the much more modern 9015. And many micro brands are able to use these movements to great effect, like NTH, for example, where it's the perfect movement because it offers you fantastic functionality, a really wonderful experience, incredibly smooth hacking and hand winding, and a pleasant movement to use. It's as simple as that, really. Which is why these movements are much more easily compared to ETA, which is, I think, the gold standard of what people tend to look for in terms of specifications, where the movements from Seiko don't tend to enjoy that sort of prestige, which is something which I think is very successful with what Miyota are doing. But as I draw this podcast to a close, I'll be very curious to hear in the comments down below what you think of this subject, because I think Citizen really is drawing in the slack behind Seiko as a brand which hasn't often been compared favourably to them in the past, but which I think now is doing an incredibly good job, and in a different way as well. They're not trying to imitate anything, they are simply themselves, which I really respect. But do also tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this format of having a midweek podcast to cover interesting subjects, and I'm more than happy to take requests or produce Q&As in this format as well, because I think it's a nice way to interact in a much less scripted way to what I normally produce. And those videos will continue irrespective of these podcasts, but I think it's an interesting new way of interacting. But as always, like, share and subscribe to help this channel if you're on YouTube, or follow us if you're listening to this on SoundCloud, which is a new medium for this channel, and something which I hope will make this more accessible to people. So thank you very much for listening. This is Watch Chronicler, out.